Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show. And we're going to have yet another good one ahead for you all. We're starting off, actually, in the world of college football, where I'll be going over Week 11 from a betting perspective. A lot of interesting games, some college football playoff eliminators, if you will. Then we'll be looking at some more general Week 10 props. Yesterday we went over some Thursday Night Football props to get you prepared for tonight's big game. Now we're just going to be looking ahead to Sunday's slate. Then I'm going to be giving you some injury updates and the ensuing fantasy implications that you might have to monitor due to these injuries as well. And then I'm going to make my picks for the week and some of the week's big games. And last but not least, we conclude by looking ahead to Sunday Night Football from a betting perspective. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you that if you want to see more content such as this, see and interact with more shows, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. That is greatly appreciated by all concerned. However, if you do want to interact with the show more directly as I live stream, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact. You can do one of two things. You can either press that $sign in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or also just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you may have throughout the show as well. I always love hearing your guys' opinions, so I appreciate it in advance, and it also makes the show that much better. So please feel free to leave any comments in my comment section. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's show, starting off in the world of college football, like I said. Now, this is potentially the week where we'll see the most shakeups concerning the college football playoff, especially in different conferences. A lot is going to be determined. And two of the games that I'm going to be talking about lay within the SEC. Very important conference. Two games that will determine who is for real and who might be a pretender in the CFP conversation. The other two games are from different conferences, one in the Big Ten, the other in the Big 12. Two games that only have one ranked team in them, but still could spring a shock this week. I wanted to balance it out, not get too many ranked versus ranked matchups in this segment each and every week, just so that we get variety, so to speak. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this segment. Starting off with one of the SEC games, perhaps the more telling of the two, at the very least. Georgia, 2.5-point favorites going to Oxford and Ole Miss. Now, this game, to me, is much more defined by defense than, say, Ole Miss's offense, which we know can be one of the most explosive in the country, versus Georgia's defense, because we all know that those are probably the best units on their respective teams. However, both of these defenses are very prestigious in their own right in the college football world. And so, as much as, Jackson Dart has to prove that he can perform against elite defenses rather than mid-tier SEC teams, I feel like both of these defenses are well equipped to kind of attack the opposing offense. On the Ole Miss side of things, it's just not just because of their prowess on the defensive side of the football. It's because, Carson Beck hasn't really looked right throughout his season. And so I feel like this point stems from a kind of innate frustration people will have with Carson Beck, where he makes big plays, does enough to win you football games, but in certain moments it looks like he's not going to perform up to snuff. And so far, Georgia has done very well in terms of compensating for any mistakes that Carson Beck makes. But they're finally facing a team that I think, offensively, even though they are kind of banged up on that side of the football. Think about Henry Parrish Jr. He's not at full health. He might be out for this game. And their leading receiver, Trey Harris, has been very limited, banged up throughout the season as well. So This offense, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, is not at 100%, but it still can hurt you down the football field. But on the Georgia side of things, it's going to be all about how to account for Carson Beck's mistakes and, if need be, overcome them. So that's why I feel like, this could be a game. However, I still think Georgia is the favorite just because that defense is very hard to score against. And granted that both Jalen Walker and Michael Williams are back and healthy, and how dominant they were in that win against Texas on the road nonetheless, this feels like the moment where Georgia makes its statement. This feels like, even though, I might see this win as lesser than the win over Texas, it's still a very important win because I feel like, weirdly enough, Ole Miss has more ways to hurt you than, say, a Texas team who is kind of looking fractured right now. So this could be a very telling test for Georgia, especially on the offensive side of the football, because granted, defenses have played very well against them. Even Texas, in that loss, played well against them. Forced turnovers against this Georgia defense. But I still think it's going to be up to this offense to get anything going against a very potent Georgia defense. That's my 2 cents. I do think Georgia will win as well. Now moving on to the ranked versus unranked game. The biggest holy war in many years, so to speak. BYU at home against Utah. Nothing better. And this one, yes, you can say that it's lost its luster because Cameron Rising's hurt. Utah doesn't look itself. They're basically playing for pride in a bowl game at this point. But this could be a potential trap game just because BYU has all the pressure on them in this one. They are 11.5-point favorites, I believe, minus 190 to win outright. And they have seemingly enough momentum to have you believe that this game could be an easy win for them. But Utah, the thing about them is that they'll never really change their identity no matter who's at quarterback. Yes, Cameron Rising makes them exponentially better, but he's not the end-all, be-all for them. We know that they have a good defense that could keep them in games. We know that they still have Brant Keithy. They still have a guy like Dorian Singer at the wide receiver position. And if they get serviceable play out of their QB position, then that could be enough against a BYU team that, granted, looks very good this season, but still hasn't been tested in quite a way that will make me believe that they're truly invulnerable in the Big 12. And so this game is a barometer for them because Utah is not where we'd expect them to be, but they're still a very dangerous threat to play spoiler to anyone in this conference for what they stand for and represent in the world of college football. So BYU has to be wary here because with all the momentum in their favor, actually, I have to correct myself. I did say they were 11.5-point favorites. I kind of wrote a little bit scribbly on my notes here. That's the over-under is saying 41.5. That looked like an 11. They're actually only favored by 4 at home. But this game will come down to BYU rising to the occasion. And if they don't, well then, consider the Big 12 a conference that's going to lose a lot of luster in the CFP picture as well. Because you want as many teams winning games in the Big 12 as possible. Because that's the only way the CFP committee will consider 2 teams in the Big 12 even getting into the CFP. So BYU has to continue to win and win convincingly for the Big 12 to really gain supremacy. It's Andre, one of my favorite commenters here on the show, enters the chat saying a trap game for BYU. Exactly what I'm thinking as well. They can't take Utah lightly no matter who's at the QB position for them. So that's my 2 cents here on the BYU-Utah game. It should be a good one. I still think BYU will have enough, but I agree with Andre's sentiment in that Utah cannot be taken for granted in this one. The next one I want to talk about, the second SEC game, perhaps the more important of the two, Alabama LSU. Alabama 2.5-point favorites, actually on the road against LSU. The over-under is 58.5. Alabama's minus 190, I believe, to win. And so this is the true game where everything in the college football world can get thrown out the window. Because if Alabama loses, you're losing a big name. And even though the 12-team playoff kind of compensates for the big brands in the sport with entertaining matchups between teams that usually wouldn't be there, Alabama being in the playoff is a huge deal, no matter how many teams it becomes in the future. And so, if Alabama loses this game, then the stakes for the parity of the sport kind of gain momentum. And so, this game feels a little more important for Alabama than it does for LSU, because LSU is in a weird spot, because I don't even think they'll make the playoff if they win this game. They've had some very odd losses, and they have not been consistent enough for me to say that they can even beat Alabama at this point and continue the season looking convincing enough to get into the CFP. So I'll have to take Alabama in this one. The key is going to be Jalen Milroe. Can Jalen Milroe play like the Jalen Milroe who is getting considered in the first round of next year's draft? Or is Jalen Milroe going to look a little bit vulnerable in this one? That's the key for LSU to figure out in this one. I still got Alabama because I would like to believe that Alabama is a team that can overcome 2 losses and still has that big brand ability, but it's going to be a dangerous one. And the last one I want to talk about before we head to break is Michigan, Indiana. Another kind of trap game feel to this, because Indiana has never beaten Michigan in its history. They're 14-point favorites, though, here in this one. And so I feel like when we consider Indiana as a whole this season, we have to consider them as a team that, yes, has overachieved, but also has nothing to show schedule-wise to really say that they can sustain this undefeated record. Michigan, as disappointing as they are, they still have an identity that's very tough to beat. It's ingrained within them, no matter what travails befall them. And so, that's why this game is so weird to me. Because Indiana, you would like to feel they have this game covered. But a 14-point spread, defending national champion weakened, but still with a core identity that they can live by at home, it just feels very weird. I would like to say Indiana wins and potentially covers this game just because, Michigan is not the same Michigan as we've seen, but it still feels very eerie when I think about this game and I'm Indiana. And so that's why I feel like this one could be highly integral to how the committee views Indiana in the near future. So that will just about do it for my college football segment. We'll come back to the world of college football in tomorrow's episode. But we're going to head to break, and after we're going to be looking at some general prop bets for Sunday's slate of games in Week 10 of the NFL. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, some lucid shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you, if you want to interact with our shows more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. Love hearing your guys' opinions. Shout out to Andre, who has been here since day one, ever since the show became a live show for the network. I thank you all in advance. It just makes the show that much better, hearing your guys' opinions on all things fantasy sports. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day here. Yesterday, we talked about Thursday Night Football from a prop bets perspective. Now we get to look ahead to Sunday's slate of games, expand our horizons, if you will, and look at more potential ways for your bets to hit. And all of these bets that I've chosen kind of feel like safe enough bets where I'm not stretching out the truth here. I'm not like overstretching my bounds, so to speak. I feel like each and every one makes sense, especially in the context of these matchups. I always say that fantasy and betting can go hand in hand because a lot of them are matchup oriented. If you feel like a certain matchup favors a certain player, then why not take the chance? And so that's what I kind of had in mind when I picked these prop bets. So without further ado, let's present them to you. Starting off with one that might be one of the more contentious ones I present to you right now. Jaden Daniels against the Steelers, hitting the under in terms of passing yards. And before you kind of say or raise speculation about this, I feel like this is potentially the safest bet out of all of them I'm going to present to you, because here's two reasons why. One, it's the toughest defense Daniels has faced to date, and two, he's not had the gaudiest numbers, so to speak. If you look at his stats, he's not over 2,000 passing yards yet. I believe he only has 9 touchdown passes to his name. There are ways and paths for the Commanders to win, and they know this as well, without having Jaden Daniels throw the ball an exorbitant amount of times and also put up gaudy numbers as a result. And it's not indicting him or adding to any detrimental factors that may arise in future Jaden Daniels games. But I am pointing out that Jaden Daniels is efficient, yet it's not necessarily efficiency that stuffs the stat sheet. And so that's why I feel like in this game, it's potentially the most difficult one remaining even on the Commanders' schedule. Jaden Daniels really is going to try and stick with the effectiveness of not necessarily forcing anything. And when he doesn't force anything, he's more efficient, and thus he doesn't necessarily have to pass his arm off. And so that's why I'm taking the under here at minus 137. So I feel like a lot of people might be skeptical about that one, but just know that it's justified because it's what I've seen from what we can glean from Daniel so far. And so that's why I have to take the under here. But in terms of someone who can hit the over, someone who's actually been pretty quiet in terms of both fantasy and from a betting perspective for that matter, how about James Cook going up against the Colts, hitting the over in his rush yards, 63.5 rush yards. And this is a guy who started off pretty hot, but has slowly simmered down as the Bills kind of diversified their passing attack. And it's to be expected, right? You want to kind of allow Josh Allen to have those opportunities to get more vertical and have more downfield threats. You acquired Amari Cooper before the trade deadline, and so you're now seeing a little bit more of a diverse or excitable Bills squad that might be to the detriment of a guy like James Cook. However, going up against a Colts run defense that, yes, just had a very impressive showing against the Vikings. I mean, not against the run, but still, as a whole defensive unit, as a collective defensive unit, had a very impressive game against that Vikings team. I feel like the Bills might want to establish the run, because that's one of the only weaknesses I really see in the Colts defense. I really actually love this Colts defense a lot more than people might expect, because it's very aggressive. The secondary is developing pretty well, and you're starting to see it translate on field. Even though they might not be picking up wins, I still see it translate on the field. And so I feel like the Bills, in certain situations, let's kind of take it as it comes, because we're not always going to have that much success. And as we've seen, the Bills kind of start off slow. So this will kind of compensate for slow starts and also teams that you can take advantage of when they have weaker defenses, especially against the run, because I feel like the Bills' running back room is underestimated a little bit, just because of all the attention and hype that surrounds Josh Allen and what he can do. And so James Cook still can perform to the standard I believe he can, but it's just not showing up because A, they might not have needed him to these past couple of games, and B, they have to kind of wait for their opportunities. And so this is the perfect opportunity, in my opinion, for James Cook to find his mojo again. So that's my 2 cents on James Cook and why I think he can hit the over this week at minus 137 as well. Well, let's get into the receivers. And this one kind of makes a lot of sense now, just because of what the Steelers did before the trade deadline. George Pickens going up against the Commanders, under 66.5 receiving yards, minus 137. He's someone who showed up in my weekly shadow report as a guy to monitor in your fantasy football team. And he shows up again for a much different reason, because I actually like what I'm seeing the growth of the Commanders secondary, and also there's now Mike Williams to worry about. And Mike Williams is also someone who's a deep threat, but also a very savvy route runner. And I think that's what Russell Wilson actually needs, and I think he wants as well. I feel like Russell Wilson, throughout his career, if you look back at Seattle, it's a perfect example of guys who could get both vertical and run routes. He loved throwing the deep ball to Doug Baldwin. Doug Baldwin, I kind of felt like at the beginning of his career, was always a deep ball threat. But then Tyler Lockett also became a deep ball threat, but also at the end of his career became a savvy route runner. And so Russell Wilson found himself relying more on Tyler Lockett. Yes, well, because Doug Baldwin retired as well, there's that, but he found himself relying on shorter passes to Tyler Lockett to move the chains. And so I feel like Russ is at his best and most comfortable when he has receivers who can bring out the best in both his short to intermediate passing game and in terms of his play action and downfield passing game as well, because they need to find more ways to stretch the field, because I kind of feel like defenses will be attuned to what the Steelers are doing and understand that Russ is going to try and stretch the field as much as possible. So adding someone who's a little bit savvier in terms of route running kind of alleviates the burden of Russell Wilson trying to always go downfield to guys like Pickens and Freiermuth. So look for Pickens to kind of suffer a little bit in this game as well. But also give credit to the Commanders secondary, because I think they're getting better and they're going to be phenomenal by the end of the year. Yes, they're not playing teams of, say, the Steelers' caliber that often, but they're still learning and still maturing. And that's important for when this team makes the playoff, because if they want to make a deep playoff run, they're going to have to find ways to cover very physical receivers. You got Amon-Ra St. Brown in that conference. You've got a lot of different guys to compensate for. So, covering guys like the Steelers in an intra-conference game, bring it on. So Commanders. So that's why I feel like George Pickens is kind of losing his luster in the betting markets. And the last one to talk about, speaking of physical players, let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite tight ends to watch, even though he is, quote-unquote, the enemy, Trey McBride. I'm going to say he's hitting his over this week. And let me check who the Cardinals are playing, because I don't always know who is playing who every week. They're playing the Jets. So that's going to be a very interesting matchup against a very fluid Jets defense from top to bottom. But I feel like Trey McBride, no matter who he's playing against, always feels like he can out-physical people. And that's a scary proposition for the NFC West and for the NFC should the Cardinals make the playoffs. And so, by him being someone who could exploit you in the middle of the field, down the field, and also you have to compensate for how physical he is while doing it. That's a very dangerous proposition for teams. And yes, this Jets defense has seen this movie before. They've played against a lot of physical guys. They know how to defend a guy like McBride. I just feel like McBride has grown leaps and bounds from where he was last year, when the Cardinals were kind of stuck in their ways a little bit. And so, from where he was last year to now, he has grown enough that I feel like he's going to be a very tough and physical out for this Jets defense. And not for nothing, I feel like when the Cardinals play, they always want to make sure that Kyler Murray is not just someone who can be the focal point of the offense, but also can be sure that his weapons can be utilized to great effect. And that's something of importance for the Cardinals stretch run here. Because if Kyler Murray gets asked to do too much, then that's where I worry about the Cardinals. And the fact that Trey McBride is now becoming more reliable is a scary thing. So that's why I feel like Trey McBride is going to start becoming a very popular commodity on betting markets week in, week out. But let me know what you think in the comments about this. I love all of these prop bets. Hopefully they hit for you if you choose to bet on them. But coming up after this short break, I'm going to be talking about some injuries that occurred this past week and the ensuing fantasy implications that you might have to monitor for this week in fantasy football. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Today for our third segment, we are going to be discussing some injuries as always and their ensuing fantasy implications. Now this week, in terms of the injury crisis that has seemingly befallen the NFL, there are very important ones. And for better or for worse, they can highly affect how you view not just players in your fantasy football squad, but how the team as a whole is affected by it. Because these injuries are very prevalent in how they'll show up on the field for these teams. The absences of these guys, so to speak, are going to show up very much so for a lot of these teams, whether they're a playoff contender or not. And most of them aren't at this point. But at the end of the day, these injuries can actually shape our kind of fantasy minds because of how kind of difficult they could be to navigate. If we don't necessarily find a solution, it's not going to, sustain our fantasy football squad. We always have to be forward thinking about injuries. Yes, we hope that these players have a speedy recovery, but we also feel like as fantasy football managers, we also have to take advantage of certain situations. So this is a very interesting, very kind of complex segment that I feel like I want to present to you more often, and I want to keep you updated on injuries of this kind of status and how prevalent they've become, especially. So without further ado, let us jump into our injury segment of the day, starting off with one that's slowly developing into a very worrisome situation because this team is not in a good place, perhaps the worst in the entire NFL right now, in terms of play on the field and in terms of situation. I feel like this injury is a stark reminder of what can happen when you're kind of backed into a corner in the NFL. So let's talk about Chris Olave here. And the news about Chris Olave should worry a lot of people because Chris Olave was seen as someone who could potentially be a trade asset in that trade deadline. Because of these injuries, because of the ensuing nature of them, this is his 5th concussion throughout his career. I feel like, a team like the Saints are bound to pay for these mistakes. They're bound to and kind of obligated to kind of cover up their tracks, so to speak, in certain situations. They can't get out of certain players. They can't get out of, the dead cap hits they're going to have to face in the future. But they also can't escape the fact that if this team is what it is right now, then what's to say Chris Olave coming back is going to necessarily be a good thing? I don't necessarily see how Chris Olave is suddenly and magically going to transform this team into a contender again, because that's where the Saints are. This is not by any means a team that's going to contend in the next 5 years, perhaps the next decade. And it sucks because Chris Olave was seen as a hopeful piece of the puzzle for the Saints. And now, with all the injury woes that have befallen him and the questions concerning his future, it's going to be a difficult uphill battle for the Saints to overcome with all the questions that are going to be asked about Chris Olave in their future. But in terms of a positive update on how things are going, he met with specialists yesterday. There was no decisions about whether or not to put him on the IR, but for what it's worth, potentially the firing of Dennis Allen kind of, alleviates some of the pressure on the Saints to release information about Chris Olave. So that's the only real thing the Saints should be happy about, is that their firing of Dennis Allen overshadowed this information. But it is a very concerning thing and a stark reminder of how, this injury information can be so integral to specific teams around the league, especially teams much like the Saints who are foundering near the bottom of the league. But we do wish the speediest of recoveries to Chris Olave because he's a very talented player when he's on the field, and it just sucks that he's in a situation like this on a team that, doesn't necessarily have any answers for him. So I just wanted to remind you of that. And this one, from a fantasy perspective, is also pretty dire because the Saints really aren't a team that, have much excitement to them in terms of the players on their roster, maybe outside of Alvin Kamara. But other than that, we wish Chris Olave a speedy recovery, and I do hope that the Saints can recover from this, but it's going to be a steep mountain to climb for them. Now let's talk about a very bizarre injury that occurred. Drake London, after catching a touchdown, appeared to injure his hip. had a headstand celebration that's been going viral, and then immediately went off the field with that hip injury. He was limited in practice this week, was day-to-day, but in terms of the fantasy implications of this injury, if it is more serious than the Falcons expect, I feel like, Drake London is the thing that makes this Falcons offense tick. He is perhaps the only reason why I have any optimism about what the Falcons offense doing. And people are saying, well, the defense's fault that the Falcons are losing game, and they are often right. The defense for the Falcons has not been living up to par, but the offense, you kind of bound yourselves to Kirk Cousins. And Kirk Cousins is not someone you want to bind yourself to for the near future. He's not someone who I would have confidence in if you're the Falcons and are planning to make deep playoff runs in the future to get you that far, or potentially win you a Super Bowl. He's just not. But I feel like when Drake London is playing at the level he's been playing at this season, that's when the Falcons are at their best, no matter who's at the quarterback position. Because he's become one of the more talented receivers in this core, has the most mature receiver in this skill position group for them. Most importantly, he's willing to kind of account for and compensate for the struggles that Kirk Cousins is facing, because Kirk Cousins is strictly someone who's not going to create out of structure. So as a receiver, that just makes your life that much more difficult, because you're always having to find ways to get open. And Drake London has been doing that to a T. So if this injury is more serious than expected, I don't necessarily see the Falcons' offense being one that's appealing to me from a fantasy perspective. And for what it's worth, I feel like they're slowly as a team losing their luster. Even though they're going to make the playoffs, they have that tiebreaker over the Bucs. In fact, won both of their games over them, so they're not worried that much about that aspect of the NFC South race. But when they get to the playoffs, it's going to become drastically clear that this team, and especially this offense, is simply not prepared. And it's going to stem down to Kirk Cousins. It's going to stem down to the failure to get these receivers to play at a top level outside of Drake London. But I have optimism that this injury is not as serious as I initially expected, and so I do hope that Drake London does come back, because the Falcons kind of do need him at this point, so to speak. Now let's talk about perhaps the worst injury of the week, perhaps the one most detrimental to fantasy prospects, Dak Prescott. Now actually, I wouldn't necessarily say this is detrimental, but it is kind of selfish a little bit to say that I actually have a little bit more hope for the Cowboys offense, because not to say that Dak was entirely holding them back, but I feel like the burden that Dak had on his shoulders in that situation forced him to kind of push too hard. And I'm not saying this caused the injury, and funnily enough, that's not necessarily what the broadcast was worried about. In fact, the broadcast seemingly did not expect to hear Dak Prescott had a hamstring injury. I believe the initial injury that people were concerned about was a laceration on his hand. So this one kind of shocked a lot of people from how low-key it seemed. But I do want to point out that the Cowboys are in a very weird place right now, because I feel that what's holding the Cowboys back is just letting loose, and I know that Dak Prescott is capable of that when healthy. However, for this season, I kind of feel like Cooper Rush coming in is an opportunity to really let loose, because now the kind of cat's out of the bag, so to speak. Now the season was a little bit of a waste, and potentially are worried about how this will play out with Dak and CeeDee's relationship, because they are now tied to this team for the next 5 years or so. So this feels like it's a wasted season. But I kind of feel like by replacing, not necessarily replacing it for good reasons, obviously, but replacing Dak Prescott with Cooper Rush, in my mind, kind of frees everybody's mind from the pressures of delivering for Dak and CeeDee and for Dak and CeeDee to deliver for the Cowboys, if you catch my drift here. But it still is a very concerning injury because we know that Dak is not playing up to par, but we know that for the next 5 years or so, that's not always going to be the case. We know how talented he is, and we've seen glimpses of what this offense can be with him. But this year just felt so weird and so kind of off for the Cowboys, is the right word, I believe, for the situation. But I feel like, this is also a not necessarily positive situation, but a situation where you have the weight off your shoulders of expectation, and you can just play freely a little bit. Not to say, again, that Dak Prescott was holding this team back. It just felt wrong from the start this season. It kind of started happy with Dak signing, the extension, CeeDee as well, but it never really coalesced because I don't believe the Cowboys are at a place where their identity is set. So that's why I feel like this injury, for better or for worse, changes how I view this team going forward and how the trajectory for them changes as well. Now let's talk about the last injury here, perhaps the least significant injury, but also an injury that a lot of fantasy football managers might not even be really hurt by, but I do want to mention it for what it's worth. The Xavier Legette injury. He did return after injuring his hand. I believe he left early in the second quarter, if I'm not mistaken. Played after the injury. But this is an interesting one as well, because if this is a lingering injury, then I feel like the Panthers had to start, asking questions about the conditions of some of these players. Because remember, Jonathan Brooks is still out, and you now are down Jonathan Mingo, even though we don't know what he would have contributed this season because he did not get off to the best of starts for them. However, the Xavier Legette injury, like I said, is not one that I would completely panic about because A, the Panthers are going to be bad anyways, and B, he did play through the injury as well. I just wanted to mention it as an injury that could be interesting to monitor if it's a lingering, like I said, thing. And also because, the Panthers have had some injury woes this season. Adam Thielen had the hamstring injury. We talk about Brooks a lot on this show. But I feel like, questions are going to have to be asked about the Panthers' injury crisis. And also how, if these players are healthy, how to get them to play better. Because that's the point as well. Because Xavier Legette, out of all these players who have been injured for the Panthers, has the most hope out of all of them, ironically. So that's why I wanted to mention this. Because of Xavier Legette's stock rising in the fantasy world, so to speak. And the last one that I don't have a picture for is the CeeDee Lamb injury, obviously. But I feel like, this week-to-week injury for CeeDee Lamb, again, kind of weird that both of them are injured now. But, like I said, pressure off their shoulders. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, I make my picks for the week in the biggest games of the NFL weekend. You definitely don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available every...
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. For our fourth segment here on the day, we are going to be making my picks for the week. Chris's picks makes its triumphant return to the show in all four games, I believe. Actually, only three that I believe I've chosen. Actually, four. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit mixed up here. 4 games we've chosen, perhaps the biggest of the week. And I feel like some of these games, feel like they're already done before the kickoff's even begun. But I do want to bring to light ways in which these underdogs potentially, shock some people. Maybe not win outright, because I've not been that confident in the games I've picked that some of the teams could win outright against the spread. But this week I feel more comfortable with these scenarios that I've picked, because I've started to respect certain teams from what I've seen from them. And also, I think some top teams that I'm kind of foreshadowing here are a little bit more vulnerable than we think. And they're not necessarily susceptible. They are susceptible, I believe, to some issues. And that's why I feel like I had to pick some games over others to kind of bring that to light, because that was something I felt I didn't necessarily do as well with this segment, to kind of pick games where I could go against the spread and pick teams that I feel will cover. But I haven't been doing that, and so I wanted to try and challenge myself this week by picking more diverse games. So without further ado, let's talk about them. Starting off with perhaps the most diverse game of them all. A divisional game in the AFC West. The Broncos take on the Chiefs. Interesting game here. Kansas City, 9-point favorites. The over-under, 41.5. Denver plus 300 to win. KC minus 500 to win. Huge discrepancy on the betting markets. Not necessarily respecting the fact that the Broncos, yes, have, not necessarily looked like they can beat superior teams. They got their butts handed to them by the Ravens this past week, and they certainly feel like they've lost a little bit of their early season hype. But I still love this defense. I still have faith that this defense can find a way to be the reason why the Denver Broncos can win football games. The offense has been steadily improving, but I don't think they're there quite yet. The defense, however, I feel has grown leaps and bounds from last season to now. Remember, this was a team last season that gave up 70 points to the Miami Dolphins. 70. And this year, they've really found their groove. But that being said, they have played some pretty bad teams. They haven't had the toughest of schedules, so to speak. I'm going to pull up their schedule right now to show you what they've beaten. In the Saints, the Panthers, and the Raiders. That's not necessarily the most impressive schedule, and it certainly shouldn't convince you that they can have a fighter's chance against the Chiefs. But the reason why I'm picking the Broncos as the first pick against the spread, to cover, not to win outright. I have to cover my tracks here a little bit, because I'm still not completely all on the Broncos train. I feel like this is one of those games where the Chiefs can be a little bit exposed, because remember, that game against the Bucs was one that, a lot of people were worried about for the Bucs. A lot of people thought that, against the best defense in the league, the Bucs would have no hope because they didn't have Evans or Godwin, and yet they kept it close. If the Broncos play smart and their defense shows up, then chances are they can cover the spread. It's not also about the offense wholly, because the defense is the reason why they've been winning football games. And they've been in football games as often as they have. So, if those two units can coalesce and find a way to A, break down the Chiefs' defense, and B, corral the Chiefs' offense, then that's a simple formula to covering the spread. So that's why I wanted to make this pick kind of a historic pick here on this segment of the show, because I've never before have picked anyone to cover the spread that was such a heavy underdog like the Broncos are. But now let's get to more games that I feel like the picks are clearer here. Let's go to 49ers Bucks here. Another kind of situation where, covering the spread makes a lot of sense for the Bucks. They are 6.5 point underdogs. The over-under is 48.5 points. San Fran minus 290 to win. Tampa Bay plus 240 to win. But the reason why I feel like I'm picking the 49ers outright to win is because of the fact that there's more optimism surrounding them now. They're gaining players. The Bucks lost players. And so I can't ignore that factor. There was a chance that potentially Mike Evans could be back by this game, but it's looking like he's going to have to sit out the bye and then return after. So that's why I feel like the 49ers, while they have to be wary of what the Bucks kind of showed the Chiefs, I feel like there's more sense of hope the 49ers can start building to what we know they can be again. They're going to bring back McCaffrey. This offense is getting a little bit healthier. The defense feels like it will figure things out. And they feel set to make that push we know they can. But why the Bucks are so appealing is because of what they showed us against the Chiefs. They showed that they can be diverse enough, and that they truly, if they're given the chance, can make some noise if they get into the playoffs as well. This will be a perfect litmus test for them, because these are the two toughest games remaining on their schedule. After that, it's paradise. It's one of the easiest schedules in the NFL after these two games. So make it through these games, potentially split them, and your gain momentum as well. But the 49ers right now are in that position already. The Bucks not quite yet. So that's why I'm taking the 49ers in this one. Then the Steelers against the Commanders. A very interesting game here. The only intra-conference game, actually, in my list here. And so the reason why this game, to me, was so important is because the surprise factor is gone at this point. These teams are two true contenders. And both of them have a very efficient feel to them. They execute their game plan, and they execute it well, and that's the reason they win football games. On the Steelers side of things, I feel it's more down to the fact that their culture has been like this since day one of the Mike Tomlin era. The fact that no matter how their team looks on paper, they can make it tough for you. Their defense has been one of the best over the past decades. And yes, they've had their offensive struggles over the past couple of years as well. But they seem to have found a decent formula with Russell Wilson at the helm. On the Commanders side of things, it's just about getting a rookie quarterback comfortable in an NFL system. And by doing that, you have to incorporate a lot of college-style things. And kudos to Cliff Kingsbury for going this deep into the season and allowing Jaden Daniels to play in this style. And as a result, Jaden Daniels repaying the favor by being one of the best QBs in the NFL. But I kind of feel like the reason, even though the Washington Commanders are 2.5 point favorites in this one, it's a very important spread to know, the Steelers still have the upper hand. As Flashball says, when was the last time two unlikely or 6-2 teams met? Tomlin finds the path to victory. For the life of me, I can't remember, but it might have involved your Vikings, I believe, as a surprise 6-2 team. And I don't remember any matchup where two teams who not just are unlikely 6-2 teams, but are unlikely in how they're run. One being run by a very contentious veteran quarterback who we know has his flaws, and we know who has to play a certain way in order to succeed, seemingly, compared to a rookie quarterback who has taken this league by storm, but is playing in a very safe, efficient system. That's what makes this matchup so unusual, so confounding. But I still have to give it to the Steelers, as Splash Bros alluded to, because of the coaching. I feel like Mike Tomlin's also a big reason that the Steelers are finding ways to win football games. And he always has been. Even if, the offense looks good and the defense looks as sensational as it's been over the past 5 years or so, it's all going to come down to the fact that Mike Tomlin is someone who gets the best out of his players. And I'm not quite sure the same story can continue for Washington, because eventually Dan Quinn got found out in his first tenure as a head coach. Cliff Kingsbury got found out as well. And this feels like the game where they could be found out. But I still think they're an elite football team. I regard both of these teams very highly now, but I still can't ignore the Steelers' ascension this year, especially considering the fact that Russell Wilson has made this offense very scary. In the last game, simple divisional game, but one that kind of lost a little bit of its betting fun. Eagles-Cowboys. Philly, 7-point favorites, over under 42.5. Dallas plus 300. Philly, I believe, minus 400 in this matchup. And this one now feels a little too simple. But if there's any silver lining for the Cowboys, I kind of alluded to in my injury segment. We talked about the Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb injuries. Yes, it's never a good thing to kind of wish on a player's downfall. But there just seemed like so much weight and expectation for the Cowboys this season. Between the tensions of the contract, between the hope the Cowboys fans had, now that everything seemingly was sorted out, to now that I feel like Cooper Rush is entering a situation that, yes, seems bleak, but actually allows him to play freely and actually see what's beyond Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, and how, once they return, this offense can be expanded. And that's all I want to see out of the Cowboys, because I'm sick and tired of the same old narrative that Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb need to be the faces of this franchise. And while they always will be, and they deserve to be, there are other players who I feel like can be utilized so that the pressure is not wholly on their shoulders all the time. So that's why I feel like this situation is a blessing and a curse at the same time. A curse because Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb don't see out the season and see how they can solve their own problems. But a blessing in that Cooper Rush is entering a system that, yes, doesn't have stars in it, but has a path forward for him to play free football. So even though I've still taken the Eagles, because the Eagles, yes, you can say Nick Sirianni is an inept play caller, they still have offensive talent that compensates for that. Jalen Hurts can play very well when he wants to. So can Saquon Barkley, so can Devontae Smith, so can A.J. Brown. And that is why I feel like the Eagles have to be favored in this one. Although Cowboys fans shouldn't say, woe is me. They should be optimistic about what Cooper Rush can bring to this team. And now they don't necessarily have to worry about this extending for a full season length and missing the playoffs because of, the tensions built with the relationships between Dak, CeeDee, and the franchise. So I hope that helps in terms of how this determines this game. And I also hope that, picking 4 very different games where, you can root for the underdog, bet on the underdog if you would. But overall, I just wanted to, diversify this segment a little bit, make it a little less bland so that I'm not always picking the favorites each and every single time. So I hope you appreciated that. But for our last segment of the day, when we return, we are going to be discussing Sunday Night Football. Lions, Texans, a little betting preview. to get you ready for that game. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. But before we get into the final segment of the day, I do want to address a comment that came in just after we went to break from Splash Bro. So much Cowboys cap room is for Dak and CD. And you have to understand that it's only going to lean more heavily towards the stars. Because remember, Micah Parsons is still up for a contract next season. And he's going to want a lot of money, perhaps the most money on the team yearly. So you have to account for that as well. Spills into the playbook. Says Splash Bros, I couldn't agree with you more in that sentiment because we see it. We see that Dak is pressing to find CD, and we see that CD, while he's playing at the elite levels we knew he would, something just doesn't feel right. He's getting a little bit more frustrated, with the rest of the offense. That should be a telltale sign that you're going to have to find ways to figure this out quick if you're the Cowboys organizationally. Let's talk about a different game to conclude today's show. Let's talk about Sunday Night Football. Let's talk about the Lions and the Texans specifically. Start off, let's talk about the betting odds here. Detroit minus 3.5 point favorites. Over under 48.5. Houston plus 165 to win. Detroit minus 195 to win. And this game is another interconference game, but I'm not necessarily that excited about it. And I'm not excited about it for both teams because I love the Lions. And they are such a dominant team. They feel like the NFC favorite to make the Super Bowl this year, and they have just been pounding teams into submission. But what frustrates me about them is that they can seemingly get ahead of themselves, I feel like. There's only so much wealth to distribute, and if you have an off day, you can be gotten. And the Texans I'm just frustrated with because they are 6-2. Or they believe they are 6-2 or 5-3 at this point in the season. So seemingly, it's carefully safe in the AFC South. They are 6-3, rather. So comfortably safe to win the AFC South, but they haven't been convincing is my issue here. So in this matchup, these are two very intriguing yet frustrating teams, mainly because you're expecting a lot from the Lions, but there has to be a seed of doubt in your mind that there's going to be one day where they just look off. And if you were, say, thinking about betting on the Texans in this one, you have to say, well, they are 6-3, but have they looked really impressive? And not for nothing, this certainly feels like it could be a blowout. But the reason why I'm hoping it's not is because, Houston has this feel to them that they're the mini Lions. They still have that identity that they built in year one of the D'Amico Ryans era, very similar to what Dan Campbell built in his first couple of years. And so that's why I feel like there is a sort of path for Houston to, get back to this kind of credo that they developed here. But the reason why I can't ignore the safer option, the Lions, is because to this point, they haven't necessarily had to kick into second gear. If you want my honest opinion, this is what the Lions look like in first gear, going through the motions, because that's how dominant they've been. As Blackhawk says, Lions, Ben Johnson have been cooking. I agree. When you're someone of Ben Johnson's caliber and have the weapons at your disposal to run such an effective offense and have a game plan week in, week out that you're confident in, you're sitting with house money here. However, it is kind of weird to see different developments in this Lions offense. I think about the ways they've won this season. For example, against Seattle, by pounding the rock, by, being opportunistic against the Vikings, and things of that nature. I feel like, if you are Ben Johnson, the danger here is seemingly choosing the wrong offensive game plan. And it's going to be very rare, because very rarely do the Lions come out looking flat this season. But in the rare occasion that the Lions have a game plan, that's when they open themselves up to vulnerabilities. But on the Houston side of things, I don't necessarily think they're well equipped to handle whatever Detroit throws at them. Because this Texans defense, is a very excitable one. It's very respected. And D'Amico Ryans is doing a good job of developing it. They have the talent. They have guys in the front who they trust. They have guys in the back end who are really improving. But overall, it just feels like they're a little step below what the Detroit Lions have built here. So that's why I feel a little bit apprehensive in feeling comfortable saying the Texans can cover the spread, no matter how minimal it is right now. Whereas the Lions, I feel like, they can't be exploited defensively. It's going to be hard to do because that secondary has really kind of compensated for the loss of Aiden Hutchinson with its ability to generate takeaways. But I also feel like it's a defense that can account for so many different things now. No matter what adversity hits them or befalls them, they feel like a defense that is heavily prepared for what's to come. And right now, the Texans' offense is one that we thought would be at a certain point this season. We're talking about them as one of the best in the NFL. They had the receiving core. Stroud was entering his second year after having a historic rookie season. Everything was sunshine and lollipops for them. But they haven't gotten to the 6-3 record as convincingly as we had hoped. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in with the the Houston Texans. How much stock are we going to place in this team if they make the playoffs, if they do it in an unconvincing manner? Because chances are this is the conclusion of the AFC South race. It's over, even if they lose, because of all those teams in there who just can't compete with them. But I am starting to look at this Houston Texans team a little bit differently. I still think they're a top 10 team in the league because of what they have. But this feels like a team that's lost a lot. As Splash Bros mentions Brian Branch, who really has been impressive, and he's going to be a huge X factor no matter what game he's playing in. So there's so much danger here for the Houston Texans as a team that is sitting pretty right now, but also knows that it could definitely have looked a lot easier over these past couple of months to get to where they are. And the Lions can prove that in a hurry. The Lions are not afraid of anyone in this situation. They're focused on finding a way to beating you, executing their game plan, and getting done with their business. And if you can't find a way to stop it or can't help but fall into their trap, then good luck to you. I feel, that the Texans, no matter how many struggles they face this season, are still on a similar trajectory with the Lions are building, and they are far ahead of schedule in that department because the Lions, remember, were not good at the start of the Dan Campbell era. They played tough for him, but they didn't win many football games. The Texans already have a playoff berth to their name in the first season of DeMeco Ryans' tenure, and they will have a second. But the second time around lost a little bit of its luster. This is going to have to be all about finding it again. Because they don't, then I'm not really confident that this team will do much for me in the future. But that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. The Splash Bros ends it with Goff on the MVP discussion. I agree. ESPN has him as there as well, and I have him in my top 3 at the very least as well. But that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. I have been Christopher Shepard. Thank you as always for tuning in. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Keep on making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. And we'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. But other than that, I am out for today. Thanks to you.